Hi everyone, and welcome to the SaaS developer community, where we learn from each other how to build SaaS. And today I want to talk about advice. We are here on YouTube, and if you're following any kind of software developer content on YouTube, you probably know that there is a lot of this extremely definitive advice. 5 things developers must never do. And this is not just a YouTube thing. You see it on Twitter, you see it on all media. Before there was YouTube and Twitter, you saw it on blogs. Before that, we had books. I cannot really blame the algorithm pushing for short content and people shouting, although I can totally blame the algorithm. But to be fair, there was always a lot of demand for give me very specific, very definitive, very simple advice on how to be a better software engineer without nuance, without it depends. And I used to be very much against it. I was like, no, there is no such thing as a best practice. Everything is nuance. Everything has to be deeply understood. Like, I was very angry at junior developers who didn't want to really deeply understand a topic and always wanted this, just tell me how to solve the problem. Just give me quick advice that will always apply. And I can just blindly follow for the rest of my career and always be awesome. And I'm now saying it like in the worst possible way, but if I think back when I was junior, a lot of the nuanced advice was actually not very useful for me. A lot of this, I couldn't really deal with a lot of the it depends. I didn't have the experience, I didn't have the knowledge, I had no clue what to do with it, and I still had problems to solve. So can someone tell me how to solve my problems? One thing I found out through a long career of actually giving advice and trying to teach other developers is there's actually very simple things that you can do to take clear, simple advice that applies in 90% of the cases, and then give a bit of extra information that will also help the developer in cases where this advice maybe doesn't apply, or to really reason about it better without going all the way into this entire it depends and you have to read gigantic books. So I want to tell you about an example in my personal history as a junior where I really needed advice and how I got the advice I needed, and then just give some examples on how this advice could be made a lot better and a lot more useful. Okay, so I want to take you back something like 20 years ago. I was a junior developer. I had maybe 3 years of experience, and I was writing this service or application. It was doing some kind of a dashboard. But so one of the things you have to do is you're building a small application, you connect to database, you need to configure a connection pool. And you have to know how big to make it, right? You need to give it some number. So, I went online, Googled how many connections should I have in a connection pool. I asked on some mailing lists, how many connections should I have in my connection pool? And I found interesting range of answers. So there was a lot of formulas, like you take the number of CPU and you multiply it by magic number. But also most people that I admired and trusted said that I cannot just follow the formula. It's not to be trusted. And there obviously it depends. And these people were nice. They told me what it depends on. It depends on how much CPU your application is using, how big is your database. It depends on how much memory it can allocate for new connections, if the memory is allocated in a different way. It depends on how much time your queries spend on I/O. Like, there were all kinds of application requirements. It was a lot of details. And the one thing that kept repeating is that nobody could give me an answer. Even if I could say exactly, okay, I'm running this many queries, I'm using that many CPU, we have that much memory, I still couldn't get an answer. Everyone was like, well, you really need to test it. And benchmarking is extremely scary when you're a junior developer. I mean, setting it up, creating a realistic workload, it's like giving me a whole new problem instead of an answer. So basically, I was drowning in people telling each other they're wrong, but I still had to come up with a number. So I did what a junior developer does when they are in a healthy team. And I went with my tech lead and I said, well, I need a size for my connection pool. I was reading online. Some people have those formulas. Some people say it depends on the other things, but they cannot really give me any number. A lot of people say you should benchmark, but I have absolutely no clue how to benchmark. And I don't know, can you guys help me out? So the tech lead told me two important things. First of all, it is okay to iterate. I can pick a number that may or may not be correct. And if it turns out not to be a good number, I can fix it later. So I don't have to decide on the perfect number upfront, which was very comforting. The other thing that he told me, also very comforting, is that if I get the number wrong, actually, I will only get fired in some scenarios, but not all of them. So imagine me as a junior developer having to pick a number for the connection pool. My fear was that if I crash the database, if I make a mistake that has horrible impact on production, I'm going to get fired. And what he told me is that, hey, if the DB crashes, you're not going to get fired. There is an entire team responsible for the database. They have to put their own safeguards. You're a junior developer. Nobody fires a junior developer if the database goes down. Did I tell you that I was working in a very good team? That's how you know it's a very good team. So the database team is responsible for putting whatever safeguards they needed around database. What I was responsible for is for the application to deliver what the business asked for. And the business requirement had a certain number of users being logged in and acting simultaneously. So it was like 100 and something. Now, not all of them are going to be querying the database, so maybe I can take 60% of it. But certain number of queries had to run concurrently. So I had to set this number based on the application requirements. It didn't really matter what was going on in the database, in the sense that if the database cannot carry the load, it is actually someone else's problem. They are very experienced. The chief DBA at the time was like 20, 30 years experience. He was famous in his own right. He wrote his own blog posts and gave his own talks. So all I had to do is make sure that I'm correctly sizing and scoping the application layer, that nobody can say, hey, the application is slow. It is okay if I go and say, hey, the DB is slow. That's actually 100% fine. So I also got a small lesson in politics. And as a result, I actually ended up moving to the database team because I was actually interested in performance and testing and tuning and all this kind of stuff. But it is important, and this is the kind of context, hey, the way your org is structured, you should look at certain parts of the problem, not the other part of the problem. Nobody online can give you this level of nuanced advice that a senior developer can give you. So the meta lesson is that it's good to give something very simple, like a rule of thumb, to unblock junior engineers, because too many detail, too much nuance, they get overwhelmed, they get completely stuck. How can a junior developer really plan and do a benchmark? It makes absolutely no sense. And obviously, the best advice with the most nuance is from someone in the same situation. But does it mean that really everything that we can do online is either the simplest, stupidest, just do X and it will work in like 80% of the cases? I don't want to call it stupid, but you know what I mean? Like the most simplistic, do X, it will work in 80% of the cases, versus, well, it's complicated, it's nuanced, hand wave, hand wave, hand wave. I don't think those are the two options. My experience tells me that you can take a simple advice and do two things to it that will make it actually like 100% times more useful for anyone, junior or senior, who is listening to it. So the two things that you really need to give is context. In what context does this advice make sense? Is it OLTP database? Does it only make sense in full moon? You know what I mean? Like, this is the shortest road from here to there, unless there is an event in the Coliseum Stadium, in which case this is actually going to take you hours and you should take a different road. This kind of thing, like a story of when does this advice apply and when it doesn't. The second thing is that you want to give is really breadcrumbs for follow-up. In case this advice turns out not to work as you wanted, how do you find out? Where can you look? What direction do you take to fix it? And this is kind of the detailed type of it depends. Like, yes, it depends on X, Y, and Z. And you can learn more about X, Y, and Z by reading these things. And you can also monitor whether you've accidentally hit some kind of X, Y, and Z scenario by looking at these metrics. And here's how you interpret them. Already much more useful. So let's talk back again about my connection pool. The context is something like, yes, you can start with 4 times the number of cores, and it will probably be more or less in the right ballpark, assuming that obviously the lives are not at stake at you getting it exactly right, which they never are. And I'm also assuming that, hey, you have an OLTP database, not a data warehouse, not a data lake, that your queries are more or less under 50 milliseconds each, that they very rarely touch disk, and that your workload is extremely read heavy. If it's write heavy, then this advice absolutely doesn't apply. If you're in data warehouse, don't even go near it. Like, let's go with that. So this is the context. And then the follow-up, how do I know if the advice is wrong? So I say something like, well, start with 4 times the number of CPU. But if you are noticing that under load, every request to your application is taking really long time and it keeps increasing, and you call the database team and they tell you, hey, we see that queries on the database take only 5 milliseconds and that our CPU is like 5%, you kind of know that your application is probably being the queue and that the database is not loaded. You can add more connections. The inverse is also correct. You can say something like, well, if the database teams calls you up and say, why are you using so much memory? We're running out of CPU. We're seeing a lot of locks and latches. We're seeing so much contention. The database is on the verge of no longer responding to any request from any of the 50 different applications that we're servicing. You, lady, are not the only application in the world. Well, maybe you slightly overdid it on the database. Or if you're seeing a lot of requests, exceptions in your application, saying something like, I cannot connect to the database because number of connections maxed out, or the other guy writing an application next to you starts running into those problems, then you may have overdone it on connections. So now you know, did you do not enough connections? Do you have too many? And you can start playing between those two, starting with a simple rule of thumb. Junior Gwen has been unblocked. She can make progress, and she knows how not to get fired. So overall, very, very good advice. This kind of advice helps anyone go from being junior to being senior because they were unblocked and they also have those breadcrumbs how to follow up on what do too many connections do to the database, what do too few connections do to an application, and so on. So I took this kind of learning and I actually applied it through the rest of my career. So I think you all know that I spent long parts of my career explaining stuff to people. And it was always, give me simple answer. How many partitions do I need in a Kafka topic? What should the value of this configuration parameter be? How do I determine this thing? And I always try to say, okay, this is a good starting point. Here is more information that would allow you to look at things. And those are the metrics you need to watch to know if you overdid it, underdid it, and how to interpret those specific metrics. And I feel like following this kind of formula with the context and those details and guardrails, but still give a concrete answer when it's at all possible, it helped me get this kind of reputation as someone who is a helpful resource for people learning Kafka. And I think helped a lot of people learn Kafka because I actually gave them a lot of pointers on how to start with something that they needed immediately and then go deeper when they needed to go deeper. So if you're a senior developer giving advice, I really encourage you to try. Don't go to any extreme. Not this is the one true answer and never do X. Yeah. Never have over X brokers was never correct for any value of X. And on the other hand, don't go into this very almost cover your ass wishy-washy. Oh, it depends. I cannot say anything definitive. I'll just tell you to try a lot of things and test. Not useful, guys. Just not all that useful. And we're here to help people and we want to be useful. It's too defensive in a way. So try to find ways to give concrete answers that are helpful and guardrails and a way to move forward. And if you're a junior developer who is listening to all those YouTubes or listening to experts or even listening to your own senior engineers and you want more helpful advice, ask for it. Say, okay, this is not concrete enough for me to make progress on. And then say, okay, I appreciate this concrete advice. Can you give me some context around where it does and doesn't apply? When should I steer clear of it? Can I just follow it forever? Or does it only apply in certain cases? And then say, okay, what should I watch just in case your advice didn't quite work as expected? Is there any metrics I can watch to know if I'm in the right direction? Are there any other considerations I should take into account while implementing this advice? And I think it will put everyone on the path for more growth and more learning if we know how to set ourselves up for moving forward, essentially. Never blocking, never getting stuck without an answer, but also never getting stuck with only one answer and trying to pretend that it always applies. So I hope this conversation was useful for you as advice giver and advice receiver, which honestly we all are all the time. We're experts in one thing, we're new juniors in another thing. I'm trying to learn JavaScript as we talk, and I'm drowning in people saying, always do X, never do Y. And I'm always asking for more context and more ways to further my learning as I'm making progress. Thank you, and see you all next time.